Well, for more on this, my colleague Rachelle Akuffo spoke with Robert Kelchen from Seton Hall University. Rachelle started by asking about how governments are able to financially back free education programs.
They afford it in two main ways. The first way is through having higher taxes in some countries like the US. But the second way, and one that doesn't get a lot of attention, is they don't allow the same amount of access to public higher education as the US. They screen students out, while the US system will give almost any student a chance, at least through the community college system.
So there's definitely some drawbacks. It's not quite a blanket thing as some people may expect. So other than taxes, are there any other sources that countries are really turning to try and fund some of these tuition-free programs?
Well, in the US, it's a different setup where the federal government provides much of the funding for tuition-free college. So there are some states where students already go tuition-free as long as they apply for financial aid.
So help us understand, a lot of people say tuition-free versus free school versus grants versus financial aid. How do you untangle all that mess? How do we decipher what's what so that students actually can be aware of the opportunities that are out there for them?
Usually tuition-free means either one of two things. Either there is no tuition charged at all, or there is a listed tuition price and students can get the entire amount covered via grants or scholarships without having to take out a loan.
Now, as we mentioned, free college tuition, no more student loans, something that would sound wonderful for students, but not everyone is happy about it. This is quite controversial. So what about the negative impacts of taking this tuition away?
There are two main negative impacts. The first one is that, yes, low-income students can attend college tuition-free, but they may not be getting as much money under the system to help cover things like books and living expenses. And the second concern is by taking away students' essentially skin in the game, having to pay for some themselves, there are concerns about whether students will be motivated to succeed in college.
And I know that's something that Ronald Reagan brought up, this idea when he was running for California governor, the idea that the government shouldn't have to subsidize people's intellectual curiosity. Is that necessarily a bad thing, though, to be able to fund an education for someone regardless of the outcome, if it doesn't necessarily end in a degree or if they're not as motivated?
It's not necessarily a bad thing, but governments have to be very careful with their money. Should they spend that additional dollar on a college? Should they spend on, say, pre-kindergarten education, on healthcare, on prisons, or on other priorities as well?
And what about private universities? How are they reacting to this idea of this proposal of tuition-free public universities?
Well, in a state like New York, many of the private universities are quite prestigious and have been used to competing against colleges where public tuition is essentially free already. But there are concerns among the less selective private universities that this notion of free college may hurt the number of students who enroll there.
So then with that being said, what's the likelihood of this gaining traction in the US and perhaps, as we've seen in Germany, picking up in other countries around the world?
I think it will gain traction in certain states and in certain levels. States that have unified democratic control are likely to at least consider adopting these programs, and these programs may also continue for community or vocational colleges, where tuition is relatively inexpensive and graduates stay close to home. But nationwide in the US, it looks unlikely, and other countries that wish to adopt it have to come up with a pretty substantial funding source.
And just lastly, as we talk about the funding source, we mentioned taxes. How do you think taxpayers are going to react if they're paying for something and they don't necessarily have children and they don't really see where their skin is in the game to having to pay for this? How do you see taxpayers potentially reacting?
I think many taxpayers won't like the idea. Either they don't have children in college at this point, or maybe they paid for college themselves and think that other people should as well. Not to mention there are the concern among many that taxes are already too high.